Hello and welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey. The Alberta election is coming up fast on May 29th, and I took the opportunity recently to speak with two of the province's construction association leaders about the previous 10 years of both the United Conservative Party and the Alberta NDP, how that affected the province's construction industry, and what they'd like to see from the leaders of either party in terms of construction policy once they take the reins in a few days' time. Up first is my interview with Paul de Jong, the president of the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada, followed by a conversation with Mike Martens, the president of the new Independent Contractors and Businesses Association of Alberta. Finally, I have an interview with Bill Black, the president of the Calgary Construction Association. I'd like to start with, I'd like to go way back to 2015 when the NDP won, which was a historic win. It's never really happened before. And what did that mean for PCA and for the industry, and in both good and bad ways? What were some ways you were pleasantly surprised, and what are some ways that you were not impressed with that particular governing body?
When the NDP came into power in 2015, there was a bit of I wouldn't say a shock to the system, but there were some tremors because for so many years, the government in Alberta had been a small C conservative government. And with that came some, I guess, regularity or certainty in my particular sector, where we're particularly focused on labor policies, apprenticeship policies, procurement, that sort of thing in the construction industry. And somewhat to our pleasant surprise, the NDP government did not immediately try to shake the tree in those areas. And in fact, as time moved on, and they did signal some desire to change some of the labor legislation, they were quite even-handed about it. They consulted widely with industry, which is always a signal you want to see, particularly when a new political party comes to town. There was no, for example, preference for what would normally be assumed to be an NDP stance, which is kind of big labor or old labor. Instead, the NDP, during their tenure, showed a fair degree of restraint. They did indicate that they were going to try to change some labor laws around things like automatic certification and that sort of thing. But we advocated quite strongly, along with our peer industry organizations, to exercise tremendous restraint. And to their credit, they did that. They did change a couple of things, but they did not really kind of dramatically overhaul the kind of the labor scene in Alberta in a way that would cause the distortions or the disruptions that we were worried about. And so as a result, the 4 years that the NDP were in power were somewhat disconcerting because of the sea change that occurred. But the engagement was high. In particular, the Minister of Labor, Christina Gray, demonstrated a very strong fitness for the file, even though it was a new file for her. She was accessible, and she was polite and considerate in terms of how she dealt with the various perspectives of the industry. And in the end, we had a relatively calm passage through that ocean. That was 4 years of NDP rule in Alberta.
And then Jason Kenney won, and I guess it was back to business as usual as far as Alberta goes. I mean, I grew up in Alberta, so I know how long the Progressive Conservatives were around. This was the UCP. It was a little different, but I would imagine you felt like, we know where we're going with these guys.
Yeah, to a large degree, that was the case, and certainly Bill 32 with the Kenney administration signaled a lot of things that we had been for ages, for 20 years, been looking for. One of them was all employee certifications, a very specific, a bit of an important change, which allowed unions like CLAC, which is the primary union that we deal with as companies, to have bargaining units based on all employee status, which is the norm in labor relations, instead of being kind of shoehorned into the narrow confines of craft designations for labor affiliation. And so that left the traditional unions with their own structure and brought on new structures for alternative or progressive unions like CLAC. and our companies began to experience the freedom that came with those new structures. The Conservatives did do some things that we were not necessarily, I wouldn't say aligned with, but we're not really that close to. Things like speaking to how unions collect dues from their members. There were some changes in that respect that we decided to kind of stay away from or stay distant from. That did concern both the building trade unions and the CLAC union because of the intrusion into their structure. But overall, the experience that we had with the Kenney administration was a positive one. I spoke of the labor law changes, but also they overhauled the apprenticeship regime. Used to be called Alberta Industry Training, and is now called the Alberta Skills Training System. And that board was overhauled. I was given an opportunity to serve on that board, along with my peers from the building trade unions and other organizations in the marketplace. And so we find ourselves with a new board at the apprenticeship level that is representative of almost every kind of consideration or aspect of the construction marketplace. And that's a good thing, that it draws from all the different voices, and some really good themes developing there in respect of breaking down some of the old silos in the apprenticeship industry and trying to respect, obviously, the safety and the particular skill sets that need to be protected, but opening up the industry so that more apprentices can come in and can begin to do things like micro-credentialing and cross-scoping of different similar scopes of apprenticeship work.
Now, you mentioned certainly with both the NDP and with the Kenney administration, of course, that all kind of came to a crashing halt last year with Kenney getting ousted and then Danielle Smith coming in. You can support her or not you, but just the royal you. But certainty is not on the menu, from what I can tell, with this election in any way. So maybe you could speak to that and how that affects you.
Yeah, I take a bit of a different point. We are an apolitical association. We don't pick political winners or losers, but we have not kind of joined some of the clamor of saying that Danielle Smith is a massive X factor and there's a lot of uncertainty there. We don't see it that way.
Okay.
Certainly our experience to date, which is perhaps relatively junior in terms of Danielle Smith's tenure, we've seen an approach to apprenticeship, an approach to labor legislation and procurement that very much fits our sensibilities of make sure that we retain a strong attachment to the free enterprise mindset of the construction industry, of the idea of parity of esteem and the apprenticeship system of opening things up. We found Danielle Smith to be a very welcome audience for those kind of policies and themes. And so, again, we don't pick sides, but we do get concerned when we superimpose a Danielle Smith early tenure with a possible change of leadership if the NDP win. Some of the things that the UCP have been saying have been welcome to us, whereas some of the things that the NDPs have been saying in the election phase have been very concerning to us.
Okay, well, that kind of leads to my next question. What are some of those things that have been welcoming that you'd like to continue and improve on if the UCP wins? And it's up for grabs now. It's like 3 or 4 days before the election. Who's going to win? It shifts back and forth every day. So let's assume the UCP does win. What would you like to see them continue, and what would you like to see them move forward with? And then we'll go to the NDP after that.
Yeah, we don't see a lot of need for fundamental or kind of considerable change in the labor legislation file. So if the UCP continue to form government, we don't call for nor expect a lot of significant change in the labor laws. The province is doing very well in those areas. We're attracting a lot of innovation from contractors. A lot of workers are eager to come to the province. The program, it's not a labor law program, but it addresses partly labor law or the labor legislation, is the Alberta Advantage program, which is really trying to say to Canadians, come to Alberta. We are a place of tremendous opportunity for jobs in the construction industry, for contractors to set up shop and really flourish in an environment that has a relatively low tax rate and an opportunity to take the best of the best when it comes to choice of workers. The labor model scheme or arrangement in Alberta is it's not the only one that has this, but it's probably the most flourishing one, where you have different labor models like the traditional building trades, the more modern progressive CLAC union or progressive union model, and the non-union model, all coming into a healthy competitive balance on construction job sites across the province. So it's really a shining example of how things ought to work when you set up an environment of choice and innovation for contractors. The other thing I would emphasize with the UCP going forward is the themes I mentioned before. Really saying to workers who have traditionally or at least recently been unattracted to the industry, women, Indigenous people, youth, we are really turning a corner with the UCP in respect of creating a culture and programs and policies that say to those underutilized groups, welcome to the construction industry, come work in this industry and really flourish here, both economically but also socially and culturally. It's a great industry. It's overcoming some of its perhaps more insular tendencies and becoming more welcoming to people of all different backgrounds.
Okay, and conversely, let's say the NDP wins on Monday. What are you concerned about, and what do you think they can improve upon from their last tenure in 2015?
Yeah, so my guess is that they would probably echo some of these issues around parity of esteem and welcoming newcomers to the industry. So I'll give them perhaps some advanced credit for that. But there's a couple of signals that come out of the NDP. I wouldn't call it their platform, because we tried to detect in their and on their website a sort of a firm policy stance on this, and all we can say is that it's an informal communication to their friends on the traditional labor side, which is troublesome because we don't begrudge relationships being made between political parties and labor unions. There's some reason for that. But when that becomes a sort of a monolithic approach where the NDP are only kind of connecting with the traditional building trade unions and the Alberta Federation of Labor, that's not necessarily wrong. It just sends a very strong signal to the marketplace that what could happen in Alberta is the same thing that's happened in other jurisdictions like British Columbia, where you have this really, really strong connection between an NDP party and traditional labor. And it kind of takes all the oxygen out of the room. And what I mean by that are two mentions that either Rachel Notley herself has made or on her behalf, Christina Gray, at the Building Trades Convention last fall, and more recently at an Alberta Federation of Labor convention, where pledges were made to, if elected, bring in BC-style CBAs and to do away with the so-called practice of double breasting. And so I can go into detail on why we are worried about those things coming to fruition. In British Columbia, the community benefit agreement situation was put in place about 4 or 5 years ago by the BC NDPs. And this is a topic that we've spoken about repeatedly, both with you folks, but also with other media outlets, where we've said that the fundamental idea behind the community benefit agreement is actually something that we can get behind, where a public project like a hospital or a bridge or a highway makes sure that it's conscious of the economic opportunities for local businesses and local workers, and to try to turn the corner a bit on some of these underutilized groups like Indigenous people and women. That's not a bad idea. But to get to those outcomes is actually quite simple. You simply task the contractors with those opportunities and those obligations, and they set about accomplishing those goals. Instead, in British Columbia with the CBA, it takes away all the ability for contractors to innovate. All contractors, whether traditionally unionized or non-union or CLAC unionized, have to abide by the same collective agreement, call it a project labor agreement. And all the workers, irrespective of any choices they've made prior to be a non-union worker, a CLAC worker, they all have to join a building trades union to be an employee on that project. And so you take away worker choice, you quash contractor innovation, and at the end of the day, because there's a monopoly on the bidding, the project costs go up. And so the taxpayer gets less bang for their buck. And so the idea of that system, which is probably one of the worst pieces of public policy I've seen in 30 years, being replicated in Alberta is horrifying to us. If the NDP are willing to sit down with us, if elected, to talk about some simple and reasonable objectives when it comes to community benefits. Let's talk about that. But please don't signal that you're going to replicate the BC model. So that's the first one. The second one that we're concerned about is the signal that they would do away with this so-called practice of double breasting. And it's an awkward term. Not sure where it came from, but the idea with that term is that it's a description of an artifact of how companies do business, not just in Alberta, but across Canada, where construction companies will have multiple corporate entities to tackle different types of work. They might have one corporate group to handle industrial work and another one to do commercial work and another still to do maintenance and pipelines and so forth. And so a company might have multiple corporate divisions, each of which, because of its business structure, can be unionized or not unionized by a union. Mm. When a union organizes one of those corporate entities and another one of those entities is not captured in that arrangement, they call that double breasting. And we simply say that's an artifact of how business is done in the construction industry. But the building trade unions and the NDP have kind of cast this negative light on it, saying that it's somehow corporations trying to escape obligations that they might otherwise have to a singular union or a group of unions. And we simply think that trying to tinker with and interfere with that approach of corporate structuring would be deeply, deeply harmful to the construction sector. It would take away, again, the right of workers to choose. It would take away the ability of employers to innovate across different labor models and really demonstrate to the owners of construction, the buyers of construction, a rich, tapestry of how construction can be done in one labor model or another. And instead, you would start to bake the cake in a singular fashion rather than a plural fashion. And so those two signals, again, they're not necessarily formal policies that the NDP have declared, but they have talked about them publicly, and we have asked the NDP to reduce the ambiguity or to answer the questions about why they would pursue those policies. And to date, we've heard no formal response in terms of why they would do that and how they would satisfy our concerns.
Okay. I guess on that note, thanks for joining us today, Paul, and we'll see how this all pans out on the 29th.
Yeah, we're looking forward to the results as well, and I thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
Thanks for joining us, Mike. I'd like to begin with, I'm going to go all the way back to Rachel Notley's government, which is a big surprise, surprise that she came in after 40-odd years of PC rule in Alberta. But what was it, just to say nice things about the people that used to be in charge, what was it that they did that pleasantly surprised you, and what is it they did that you opposed in terms of how it affects the construction industry in Alberta?
Yeah, right. Considering the fact that they really didn't expect to win and didn't have an experienced bench to support, I think the leadership, the Premier's office was pretty competent, but they didn't really have the support infrastructure, and there were a number of weak ministers. For construction, I think Christina Gray, in Labour at least, was a good choice and a very competent minister who sincerely talked and listened to industry. I do think in general, they made some half-decent signals to the oil and gas industry, indicating that they weren't going to be too radical. And I think that's kind of the theme of their entire term. They weren't too radical. And, all in all, they weren't horrible for the construction industry. There wasn't any major wins, but I think everybody's expectation was extreme, and they weren't. Okay. So that's a compliment. The things they did bad, though, they still did. If I can remember correctly, they got rid of secret ballot and went to card certification, and I think some of the other changes were some minor but really inconvenient rules regarding the costs on owners and contractors for employees. And so definitely, and this was expected, that the pendulum would shift that way. You expect that under an NDP government. But all in all, it wasn't horrible. And if that's saying something good, then that's good.
And then we get to Kenney, who won in a landslide in 2019. And how, given that you've probably worked with PC governments before, and this was the UCP, but it seemed like, more or less a PC government or the same style of thing. What was the effect of construction at the time?
Yeah, I think Jason came out of the gate strong and reversed a lot of the negative things that Notley had brought in, not just for the construction industry, but for the province as a whole, definitely reaching out to his base and satisfying some of their concerns. My knowledge of the agriculture industry isn't deep, but I do remember him making sure that he reversed some of the changes that really made them upset. So that set him up with his base pretty strongly for a while there. But then, of course, shortly after that, COVID hit. And what my biggest recollection of that time was comparing. Of course, at the time, I was a director of public affairs for Western Canada. And so I could compare 4 different provinces pretty closely and intimately in how they were responding. And here you had 3 provinces, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC, who had almost identical policies. Like if there was a shutdown, they were within a week of each other. If there were mask provisions, they were within a week of each other. It was almost identical. But the approaches were different in each province. In Alberta, Kenney took the stage quite a bit. In BC, Horgan sat back and just let the director of health, whose name I can't remember right now,
Funny.
Yeah. Right, yes, took it all on her shoulders. Saskatchewan, I didn't follow as closely, but there was kind of a little bit more of a balance between the two. Then you look at the public perception of their leaders during that time, and night and day different. And this was astounding for me from a political observer, the real differences between the provinces there. And I think that sets up, of course, Jason's eventual demise.
Right.
I don't know how he could have done it differently, but so if you talk about strengths and weaknesses there, came out of the gate strong, appealing to his base, but in the end, it's his own base or people, maybe not the base in terms of existing membership, because I know a lot of new members signed up. But those people would traditionally have been conservatives. And so he didn't get defeated by, a sudden new onslaught of NDP voters or people flocking to the NDP. It was people behind his own friendly lines who decided they'd had enough and they took it out on him.
And so this goes to what I was going to say next. Alberta has always been, one of the reasons this election is so interesting is that it's unpredictable. And that's something that Alberta has traditionally not been. It's been very predictable one way or the other in terms of politics. And so now you've got Danielle Smith, who, when did she start? Like 6 months ago, 7 months ago, something like that, maybe a year. But her tenure has been a lot of things. Predictable isn't one of them. So how does that affect the industry? Or is it good? Has it been good for the industry in this short time?
Yeah, there's a saying in politics that no government is ever elected into power. Governments are elected out of power. And consistency is a big reason for that. Like if Danielle, and you can see the polls, there are key moments in the last 6 months, maybe a speech at a chamber of commerce, or in this case, or the budget, let's say, or there's another moment recently, which is the debate. These were times when Danielle, Premier Smith, came out stable and kind of normal. And her polling numbers shoot up almost instantly. And then there's the times in between where a whole bunch of really strange things happen that nobody can tell what's going to happen. And instability is always bad in politics and in business. And that's, I think, very much related. Is this election, I think, will be won or lost depending on the confidence of the business sector in Premier Smith. And we all know that it is a common line that with policies, you don't want big swings. And of course, this is a problem in British Columbia where an NDP comes in and all the labor laws swing one way. And then the Liberals or a right-wing, right-of-center government comes in and it swings the right way to business. And you have these big swings, and that makes it really hard for stability in businesses to plan ahead, to commit to long-term projects. And I think a lot of people are in the back of their mind going, can we depend on stability here? And we don't want extreme changes. And you could argue that that's actually at the core of what it means to be conservative. Let's not change things too radically here.
Right.
That's one aspect, at least psychologically, of a conservative. And I think the problem is that there's a big swath of people who now consider themselves conservative or would take that name upon themselves, but they're asking for big changes. And that's maybe what you call populism or something like that. And we're seeing that in the Premier is having a hard time navigating those two. And that's probably what Jason Kenney had a hard time navigating as well. Jason chose one side of that equation and paid for it because the other group in his camp didn't like that.
And so with the UCP, because it's pretty much down to the wire as of we're recording this on the 24th. That's almost a week till the election. But it's depending on what poll you look at, like one of them is edging in out of the other. It's not really all that predicted. It's not like the usual landslide back in the old days with PDCs. So let's say the UCP wins. What would you encourage them to do that they aren't already doing for the construction industry?
Sorry, just in terms of construction?
Yes.
Yeah, well, you know, as people in the industry know, our industry is dependent on economic growth, which I think right now could happen if we have a stable environment. So a number of things that are in the Premier's control on that are tax rates, and the Jason Kenney did fantastic reducing Alberta's corporate tax rates to the lowest in the country by far. And Notley, I know this is, what should you do if you get elected? But of course, this is the big thing with Notley, right? If they come in and increase that 38% and eliminate that part of the Alberta advantage, that worries a lot of businesses. Many have moved here and invested here based on that 8%. These are the kind of swings that we don't want to see. So again, the note here, I would say for Premier Smith, if she gets elected, is to steady the ship. Show signs of consistency. There's not going to be radical changes. Showing signs of diplomacy, reaching out. I think the business community wants to see somebody who can assuage tempers and on both sides. Within the UCP, there's still some very strong feelings. How can she manage that? If you're asking me for suggestions, man, I would be making a lot of money right now if I had a suggestion on how to do that, because there are some significant problems which are related to the whole province. You have the rural is pretty much united. You have Edmonton, which is united, and Calgary, which is divided. And how to get in there, I think everybody in this province is united on a strong economy that provides good jobs, and that's just good policy for the construction industry. If Alberta's economy can just grow as it's expected to, the construction industry is going to be great. Does that mean there aren't things to refine? We still have problems with WCB. There's this whole experimental policy on prompt payment, which some in the construction industry are happy with, others are not. How will that work out? And these are all important things, but in the big picture, people are working really hard right now. Our problems are more in workforce supply. We can't find enough workers because it's so busy. So that's a good problem to have. Let's work on those problems rather than worrying about, separation, which of course the UCP is trying to temper down and saying when we said sovereignty, we didn't mean separation. We just meant a stronger role for Alberta. My impression of our members and the business community is let's temper that a little bit more. Let's get back to a negotiation and collaboration conversation.
Okay. And so conversely, let's say the NDP wins on Monday. What would you give them as advice?
Well, I'd have to almost ask for the impossible here. I'd have to say, go back on what you said you're going to do. You said you're going to raise business taxes. You said you're going to bring in exclusive tendering for unions on public service contracts. You said you're going to restrict businesses from operating the way they have for the last 30, 40 years regarding, setting up new businesses that work under different labor models. These are all signals of an attack on the business community. So my advice to her is change your mind. Don't do what you said you're going to do. That's where I would go.
Okay. Thanks for joining us today, Mike.
My pleasure, Warren. Thank you.
I'd like to start going back to 2015 when Rachel Notley won for the NDP, which was historic. The NDP had never won in Alberta, and I'm sure there's some apprehension at first just because it was new and different. But what did you find good and bad when during her tenure?
Well, I mean, I think it's probably fair to say the NDP themselves were just as surprised as everybody else. I think they had to scramble. I mean, from a construction industry perspective, the NDP committed to a lot of projects, a lot of work, a lot of infrastructure, schools, hospitals, etc. And so as a major procurer of construction services, they created a lot of activity, which is always a good thing. You hope that whichever group is in that seat at the end of the day, that they commit to regular and predictable volumes of work so that you as an industry can plan what to expect for long term, so you're not constantly reacting. So I think from that perspective, I think NDP provide a lot of activity. There were a couple of hiccups. Understatement of the year, Grand Prairie Hospital was a major black mark for all concerned, whether industry or government. And I worry that industry and government didn't sit down and learn from that. And instead, I think people entrenched on all sides. And I think there was a missed opportunity for government to accept that as a major stakeholder, you can't say it's all the industry's fault. And, the industry is used to being villainized, and so perhaps didn't think that we had the ability to sit the parties down. And so I think there was the incredibly important and valuable lesson opportunity that was not taken advantage of. And I think we're still seeing the ramifications of not having taken advantage and learned on all sides how to do that better.
And with the UCP coming in, I mean, it's the UCP, it's not the same party as it was, but it's the Progressive Conservatives more or less, which is kind of what people were used to in Alberta. So what was construction's take on them, and what did they do right and wrong?
I think that when the UCP came back in, I think they continued to fulfill the role of that major procurer of construction. They continued to move significant projects and activity forward, but I feel that they did not fully understand that the way in which they engaged our industry, their risk profiles that they started putting on industry through their procurements, and the incredibly demanding nature of them as an owner, really. And I believe that was an internal lesson taken out of Grand Prairie. Instead of sitting down with industry, they ramped up some of their processes. And I think they entrenched the difficulty of working with them as a customer.
And so now we've got, obviously there was Kenney's ouster and Danielle Smith came in, and the construction industry, well, all industries like certainty, like consistency. We haven't had that for the last year, and it's an election that's a neck and neck. So it's pretty up in the air who is going to win. What's your take on that sort of climate that we're in, and what it'll be like no matter who wins on Monday?
Well, I think the one thing that seems to be clear, no matter who wins, the administration is going to stay the same. And the administration is the face that our industry sees more of in terms of the day-to-day interactions between the province as an owner and us as a service provider. And so I think that the inherent challenges and tensions and behavioral difficulties that our industry has working with the province is going to continue no matter what the outcome is on May 29th. And I do think that there needs to be a little bit of a recognition that our industry serves Albertans too. It's not just the province, it's not just government, provincial and municipal and federal. Our industry serves Albertans too. And you can't deliver healthcare, you can't deliver education, you can't deliver infrastructure if you become a very difficult customer of the construction industry. I'm not saying our industry is some angelic, innocent party here. Our industry has brought on issues on itself. There's no doubt about that. But there's an overarching commitment to do this well from our industry. And I'm not sure that that is respected or fully understood. And I certainly know, based on some of the procurements we've seen, and some of the information we hear from our members of who have been involved in some of the significant projects, there's absolutely no doubt that there is something significantly wrong with the way the province feels it can treat members of our industry. And they have an excuse, they have a reason, and I'm sure they're well-meaning, but I don't think there's enough people within these administrative groups that really understand the halo impact of certain behaviors on the small business owners that operate in the construction arena. Most construction companies are small owner-operator businesses. And I really think to make Alberta great in terms of its infrastructure and its healthcare, and really make these fundamental components of the Alberta advantage the envy of Canada, industry stakeholders and government stakeholders need to sit down, understand each other better, because it's a lot harder to dislike somebody you've actually met. A piece of advice I was given many years ago. And we all actually want the same thing. We want successful projects, great buildings, great assets, and great infrastructure that will serve Albertans of the present and help grow the Alberta of the future.
Okay, thanks for joining us today.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Construction Record Podcast. You can hear us on Apple Music, Amazon Music, and Spotify, as well as on the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce websites. And if you're in Alberta, don't forget to vote May 29th.